The Forerunners shaped Halo more than any other civilization, but their history was never built around one person. Their legacy came from rulers, scientists, warriors, and the institutions they created, and this ranking is about which of them left the biggest mark on the galaxy. The placements are based on direct influence: who changed Forerunner society most, who altered the fate of other species, and who had the widest impact on the events that followed. This is not just a list of the most famous names. Some entries matter because of leadership, some because of invention, and some because their decisions set entire conflicts in motion. As the countdown climbs, that influence only grows until the top spots belong to the figures and forces that defined the Forerunner era. At number 10, Riser earns his place by showing the Forerunners at a smaller scale. He was not one of the figures who shaped the fate of the species, and he never had the kind of influence that could redirect Forerunner history. That is exactly why he stands out. Riser helps show what life looked like outside the highest castes and the biggest decisions. Through him, the Forerunners stop feeling like a single block of power and start looking like a society made up of people with duties, loyalties, and limits. His value is in perspective. He helps explain the everyday side of a civilization usually remembered for giant projects, strict discipline, and long conflict. He also reminds us that not every Forerunner was part of the builder elite, and not every member of the species had real power to change the direction of the empire. Riser can reflect the culture, but he does not define it. He shows what it meant to live inside that system without being one of the people who controlled it. That matters because the Forerunners are often discussed in terms of abstraction: domains, shields, installations, and civilizational scale. Riser pulls the focus back to a lower level, where status still mattered and where most lives were shaped by decisions made far above them. That is why he sits near the bottom of the ranking. His role is meaningful, but narrow. He adds texture and context, not decisive influence. When the bigger story of the Forerunners is being told, Riser matters as a witness, not as one of the forces driving it forward. He helps answer what the species looked like from the ground level, but he does not change the central conflict, the political structure, or the long arc of their collapse. At number 9, the Didax warrior servants move up because they were far more than a single perspective. They were one of the major military arms of Forerunner society. They fought wars, enforced order, and carried out the suppression that helped keep the empire intact. If the Forerunners were projecting strength across the galaxy, these were the forces turning that strength into action. Their existence tells us something important about the species. The Forerunners were not only builders and thinkers, but also an empire that relied on organized force to hold itself together. They are placed here because they represent reach and capability rather than final authority. The warrior servants were essential to the Forerunners' military success, but they still operated inside a structure built by others. They did not sit at the center of the species-wide mystery in the way the great decision-makers and guiding institutions did. Their job was to carry out Forerunner intent, not to define it. That makes them important, but not central enough to rise higher. In a ranking like this, that distinction matters. A group can be indispensable to how the civilization functioned without being the reason we remember it in the first place. Even so, their importance should not be understated. They gave the empire its ability to enforce its will. They mattered in war, in security, and in the broader maintenance of Forerunner control. They also help explain why the Forerunner machine was so hard to stop once it was in motion. Number 8 is the Master Builder. This is where the ranking starts shifting from pure Forerunner technology to the people and institutions that directed the civilization behind it. The Builders were one of the most powerful castes in Forerunner society, and the Master Builder represents that entire political force, ambitious, organized, and convinced that technical mastery could solve nearly any problem. That mindset shaped expansion, construction, and the massive systems the Forerunners used to manage their empire. It also shaped how they understood progress, because for the Builders, construction was never just practical. It was a statement of authority. He belongs here because builder influence was enormous, but not the broadest or most lasting force in the setting. The Master Builder mattered as a symbol of builder dominance and as a driver of Forerunner policy, especially in the way the civilization valued scale, order, and legacy. That thinking helped define what the Forerunners became, but it also fed some of their worst mistakes. A culture that leans too hard on infrastructure and control can start treating restraint as weakness, and that pattern shows up again and again in their history. The Builders were often behind solutions that looked elegant in theory and disastrous once the consequences spread beyond the intended system. That is why the Master Builder matters. He stands for a mindset, not just a title. There is also a real political angle here. In Forerunner society, the great rates and castes were not just jobs, they were competing ideas about how civilization should work. The builder perspective leaned toward consolidation, monumental projects, and long-term control through engineered systems. That gave the Forerunners some of their most impressive achievements, but it also made them trust institutions that had grown too large to question. The Master Builder sits right on that fault line. He is not the most personally influential figure in Forerunner history, but he helps explain why the species invested so heavily in the structures and networks that later generations would spend centuries trying to decipher. Still, the Master Builder ranks below the figures and creations that shaped the Forerunners more directly and more permanently. His importance comes from what he represents: the political class that helped guide the species into its greatest achievements and its eventual overreach. That makes him a major part of the mystery, but not one of its deepest centers. Number 7 is the domain. This is one of the most important Forerunner creations ever described, because it sits at the center of how they preserved memory, knowledge, and continuity across their civilization. The domain was far more than a simple archive. It was a vast information network that stored records, strategy, identity, and the accumulated thinking of the Forerunners themselves. For a species that old and advanced, a system like that was not optional. It was one of the ways they kept a civilization of that scale from fragmenting under its own size. The domain matters because it outlived the people who built it and carried pieces of their civilization forward after so much else was lost. It preserved knowledge, which also means it preserved their fears, their plans, and the traces of what they had already lost. That is a big reason the Forerunners remain such a mystery in Halo. So much of what later generations learn about them comes from fragments that survived through systems like this one. The domain is one of the few reasons the Forerunners are more than ruins and legends. It gives later eras access to the shape of their thinking, not just the shape of their machines. It also explains why the Forerunners feel so distant and hard to pin down. A civilization that can preserve its memory on this scale can blur the line between history and infrastructure. The domain was not only a storage system, but a way of keeping the civilization conceptually alive, even when its people were gone, divided, or destroyed. That makes it one of the clearest examples of how the Forerunners tried to defeat time through design. In their own minds, knowledge was something to be built, managed, and inherited. It still ranks below the top of the list because the domain is a tool, not a historical actor. At number 6, Faber of Will and Might stands out less as a heroic figure and more as a clear sign of what was going wrong inside the Forerunner Empire. He was a major builder leader, and that placed him near the center of power in a civilization where the builders controlled design, infrastructure, and a large share of political influence. But his importance comes from what he represents. Faber is not remembered for a single defining achievement on the level of the Halo Array or the Didact. He matters because he shows how a ruling class can become trapped in its own certainty, where status and ideology matter more than practical judgment. In the wider history of the Forerunners, that kind of arrogance was not a side issue. It helped turn a powerful civilization inward, where rivalry and self-importance made it harder to face real threats. That is why Faber ranks here instead of higher. His role is significant, but mostly as part of the machinery of decline. He is one of the figures that helps explain how the builder-led order became brittle and reckless. When a civilization this advanced starts making decisions based on political dominance and institutional pride, the results do not always look dramatic at first. They can look like slow decay, bad priorities, and leaders who think they can control outcomes they barely understand. Faber fits that pattern. He belongs in the discussion because he helps define the Forerunners' ethical fracture, but he is still more a symbol of the problem than the answer to it. His place also makes sense when you look at how Forerunner history is usually remembered. Most people focus on the grand technological legacy, but the Empire's collapse was also driven by people who treated that legacy as proof they were beyond consequences. Faber sits right in that mindset. He reflects a political culture where the builders could lean on power, tradition, and institutional prestige, even as the wider civilization was losing its grip. That kind of leadership did not just fail in a single dramatic moment. It created conditions where failure became normal. In that sense, Faber is important less for what he personally built than for what his kind of leadership allowed to happen across the Empire. At number 5, the Isodidact moves closer to the heart of the Forerunner tragedy. This is where the ranking shifts from people who helped build the system to the ones who had to manage its collapse. The Isodidact matters because he helped guide the final Forerunner response to the flood, and he stands among the last leaders trying to make something survivable out of catastrophe. He is not just another military figure, he represents duty after certainty has already failed. By the time he becomes central to the closing stages of Forerunner history, the civilization is no longer looking for victory in the normal sense. It is looking for any path that might keep life and memory from being erased completely. That makes the Isodidact one of the most important surviving Forerunner leaders in the story. He is tied directly to the Halo project and to the impossible choices that came with it. Those choices were never clean, and that is part of why he matters so much. The Forerunners are often remembered as an empire of vast technology, but the Isodidact shows the cost inside that scale. He is a figure shaped by guilt, responsibility, and the need to act when every option is terrible. In both the core lore and the broader expanded material, he becomes a bridge between the old Forerunner order and its final acts of desperation. That gives him a much larger historical footprint than Faber, because he is not just a sign of decay, he is one of the people left standing when the decisions finally had to be made. What makes the Isodidact especially important is that he belongs to the endgame of the species, not just its politics. Once the Flood had become an extinction-level threat, Forerunner strategy stopped being about preserving dominance and started being about preserving anything at all. The Isodidact's position in that moment gives him direct weight in the events that shaped the modern Halo setting. At this point in the ranking, the focus moves from political decline to the people and creations that best show how the Forerunners tried to survive their own collapse. That is what makes number 4, the Librarian, so important. She is not just a well-known Forerunner figure, she is one of the clearest examples of a mind that understood the scale of the crisis and answered it with preservation instead of conquest. The Librarian matters because she worked on the long view. While much of Forerunner history is defined by control, hierarchy, and technological pride, her influence points somewhere else. She treated life as something to protect, study, and carry forward. In Halo lore, that connects to genetics, species preservation, and the survival of information across enormous spans of time. She represents the idea that the Forerunners did not only build weapons and systems of power, they also built archives, contingencies, and plans meant to outlast extinction. That makes her one of the best windows into what the civilization believed it was doing right, even as everything around it failed. She ranks this high because her impact reaches beyond the Forerunners themselves. Human history is tied to choices associated with her, especially in later lore, where her planning extends beyond the fall of her own people. That gives her unusual weight in the story. She is not simply a survivor of Forerunner history. She is one of the figures trying to shape what comes after it. In a setting where most Forerunner names are tied to war or collapse, the Librarian stands out because she represents foresight. She understood that power alone would not save the Empire. Something had to be preserved if any meaning was going to remain. That foresight matters even more when you consider the civilization she was working inside. The Forerunners were not short on intelligence. They could build star roads, manage ecumene-wide systems, and reshape entire worlds. But their greatness came with a dangerous assumption that if they could control enough variables, they could control history itself. The Librarian pushed against that instinct. Her role suggests that some Forerunners understood the need to protect living things instead of reducing everything to infrastructure and command. That gives the species a moral dimension that would otherwise be easy to miss beneath all the machinery. She also connects to one of Halo's central themes, which is inheritance. The Forerunners were always deciding what should survive them, and the Librarian is the clearest expression of that impulse. Not just data, not just monuments, but biological potential, cultural memory, and the possibility that future species could carry forward what the Forerunners could not. Her legacy feels unusually direct in a franchise that often leaves ancient civilizations half obscured. Even when the details get technical, the idea is simple. She was trying to keep life from being reduced to rubble by the choices of her own people. That is why she sits above almost everyone else in this part of the list. The figures below her helped run the machine. The Librarian helped decide what would still matter after it broke. Her legacy is quieter than the Halo array, but it reaches deeper into the saga. The array could end a war. The Librarian was trying to shape the species that would exist after war stopped being the only question. Number 3 is the Halo array, and this is where the ranking shifts to the most famous part of Forerunner legacy. The rings are the clearest symbol of what the Forerunners were capable of, and of what was wrong with their final logic. They were built as a last response to the Flood, a weapon designed to deny the parasite any living hosts by wiping out the galaxy-wide ecosystem it depended on. That alone would make them important. The reason they rank this high is that the Halo array defines how modern Halo understands the Forerunners at all. The rings are more than weapons. They are a statement about the limits of Forerunner civilization. They show a species that had enough science to threaten life on a galactic scale, but not enough wisdom to find a clean answer to the Flood. Building the array reveals how completely the Forerunners had shifted from preservation to extinction math. That choice is one of the biggest reasons they remain such a mystery. The galaxy does not just wonder what they built, it wonders how a civilization reached the point where this seemed like the only remaining solution. That is part of the array's lasting weight in the timeline. It was not a single desperate weapon used in isolation. It was the center of a larger strategy tied to the Halo installations, the Shield worlds, the Ark, and the broader effort to reset life after the Flood had consumed everything it could reach. The Forerunners were no longer trying to win in the normal sense. They were trying to preserve the chance that life might begin again, even if that meant ending almost all life first. That contradiction is built into the rings, and it is why they remain one of the most disturbing creations in the setting. What makes the Halo array even more significant is how completely it outlasted them. The rings survived the Empire, the command structure, and most of the context behind their creation. That means they are not only the Forerunners' most infamous invention, they are also the most visible remains of their civilization. Every time the series returns to a Halo installation, it is returning to the Forerunners' final answer to a problem they could no longer control. No single character explains their collapse better than the Flood, but no single creation explains their willingness to sacrifice more than the array. It also matters that the rings are still being fought over in the present day. Covenant zealots, UNSC personnel, and remnants of older powers all treat them as objects of terror, worship, or strategic value. That ongoing relevance keeps the Forerunners from feeling like a dead civilization locked in the past. Their final project continues to shape decisions long after the species itself is gone. At number 2 is the Didact, and he earns that place because no other Forerunner figure captures their strengths and failures so completely. He is the clearest example of what the Forerunners wanted to be at their height: disciplined, militarily dominant, and convinced that order could be maintained through force if the right people stayed in control. He also shows how badly that mindset broke down once the Flood became an existential threat. The Didact matters not just because he was powerful, but because his role sits close to the emotional center of Forerunner history. His conflict with the Flood, his connection to the Librarian, and his place in the civilization's final collapse make him feel less like a side figure and more like the face of the Empire's last major crisis. What puts him above almost everyone else is how much of the Forerunner story runs through him. He is tied to military command, to the ideology that shaped their thinking, and to the desperate logic that led them to build the Halos. Even when the details shift between sources, his basic function stays the same. He represents the Forerunners as a warrior civilization forced into choices that should never have been necessary. He is not the deepest cause of their fall, though. He is the leader who shows what happened when their power was still intact, but their confidence was already starting to crack. That places him at a very specific point in the timeline, not at the beginning of Forerunner greatness, and not at the final end, but at the moment where those two things collide. That is also why he matters so much in terms of consequences. The Didact is linked to the kind of thinking that treated force as a solution to every problem, and the Flood proved that mindset was never enough. Once the parasite spread, military superiority stopped being a clean answer. The war became a matter of sacrifice, containment, and increasingly harsh decisions, and the Didact is one of the figures most associated with that shift. He stands in for the broader Forerunner habit of believing they could manage any disaster if they had enough authority, enough technology, and enough control. The Flood shattered that confidence, and the Didact is where that collapse is easiest to see. He also ranks this high because he helps explain the emotional side of the Forerunners, which is easy to miss if you only focus on their machines and megastructures. They were not just a cold civilization of builders. They had internal disagreements, political tension, and different ideas about responsibility. The Didact makes that visible. He is not simply a symbol of strength. He is a symbol of how that strength was redirected, hardened, and eventually cornered by a threat it could not dominate. Even without leaning on every specific version of his story, his role stays consistent across the lore. He is the warrior commander whose choices reveal how far the Forerunners had fallen before the end. That puts him just below the one force that made all of those choices necessary in the first place. At number 1 is the Flood. Nothing else explains the Forerunners as completely. The Flood is not just another enemy in their history. It is the reason their empire moved from expansion to panic, from control to extinction-level planning. Without the Flood, the Halo array does not exist in the same form. The final war does not take the same shape, and the Forerunners are remembered very differently. The parasite is the trigger for their worst decisions, but it is also what exposes how fragile their civilization really was once it faced a threat it could not outmaneuver. That is what makes the Flood the most important force in the ranking. It explains the Forerunners' technology because so much of that technology was built around containment, survival, and desperate countermeasures. It explains their downfall because they were forced into a war they could not win through ordinary means. And it explains their mystery because so much of what remains of their civilization only makes sense when you understand the scale of the threat they faced. The flood did not just defeat the Forerunners in a military sense. It changed the meaning of their entire empire. A society built around preserving life, order, and responsibility ended up choosing a weapon that would erase almost everything left behind. The other reason the flood belongs at number 1 is that it is bigger than any single character, ruler, or doctrine. The didact can show how the Forerunners reacted. The librarian can show how they tried to preserve what mattered. The domain and the larger remnants of their legacy can show what they left behind. But the flood is the pressure that forced all of those responses into existence. It is the event that turns the Forerunners from an advanced galactic power into a civilization defined by collapse. That leaves the Forerunners as more than a lost civilization. Their greatest minds built machines that could preserve life across the galaxy, map species, and hold back extinction. But the same drive that made them exceptional also led to control, secrecy, and answers that came too late or cost too much. That is why they remain central to Halo's lore. They matter not just because they are old, but because the setting keeps pointing back to their choices, their reach, and their failure to outrun the consequences. Ranking the Forerunners means ranking a civilization defined by genius under pressure, and the verdict is clear. They were powerful enough to reshape history, but never wise enough to escape it.